We are joined first up this evening by Brianna McKee, a Research Fellow at the Institute for Public Affairs and the National Manager of Generation Liberty. Brianna, welcome to Spectator TV.
Thank you for having me.
Last week, you had an article that went absolutely viral on the Specky website called "The New Space Race Putting Woke into Orbit." Now, I believe the comment that got you trending, Brianna, was a quote from the Associate Dean of Indigenous Engagement at Monash University's Faculty of Information and Technology, which is like the longest title anybody's ever had. And he said that the objective of a new program, which I'll get you to tell our viewers all about in a moment, was, and I quote, to find the first Indigenous astronaut and help get them into space. Indigenous Australians were the first scientists, technologists, engineers and mathematicians. They've been using STEM for over 65,000 years, end quote. Now, a civilization of mathematicians must have been pretty tricky and quite an achievement without a counting system. Brianna, how did we get here and what is this completely crazy project from the historically challenged Monash University?
Well, the key issue with the National Indigenous Space Program is there's too much of a focus on race and not enough of a focus on space. The program prioritises equity over education. And we've seen the rise of affirmative action, critical race theory and identity politics, and this has coincided with a decline in academic standards. So over the last few years, the latest Times Higher Education ranking showed our universities slipping significantly, and also the latest Productivity Commission report shows that poor quality and highly variable teaching is actually failing our students, and they're leaving universities to join the workforce unequipped to deal with these real-world demands. So this is an incredible problem for them individually, but also for the nation at a broader productivity and societal level.
And what actually is this project? Because it seems like it has something to do with race and something to do with NASA. What is Monash University trying to achieve with this project?
Well, what they've done is they kick off the program with a space boot camp with Monash University's IT department, and then this is followed by a 10-week internship with NASA. So that's the space aspect, but to get in, you have to identify as Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander. And so this identification has been called into question by many parties, and chief among them are Indigenous advocates. But really what we're seeing is the university sector is trying to pass on this view of the world to students through the prism of class, race and gender. And this educational philosophy is highly impractical, and it doesn't actually address the real barriers that Indigenous students face.
Or indeed Australian students face. I was always a space kid growing up. I took astronomy, I had telescopes, I was the president of the astronomy club, it was my thing. And they used to tell us back then that it's not so much that you're a woman that's the problem. Being an Australian poses issues for getting to space because obviously we don't really have the launch pads required, so you have to find a way to get to the US and to NASA and to one of their space programs, and that seems to all be gone now. And I don't believe that readers who loved your article so much had a problem with Monash fast-tracking students to NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. That's kind of cool. I think they were more worried about it being based solely on race. And further, their statement about needing to help Indigenous people get into space seems a bit strange if they said they were the first astronauts, but we'll just leave that aside for a second. You pointed out that this course might not even benefit Indigenous people at all. What did you mean by that statement?
Well, basically that the requirement to apply for this course is that you identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So that means that anyone could identify as this. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be helping Indigenous students. It's a program that could be easily used and abused. And I think that's problematic for people who want to actually help Indigenous students. And of course, we need our best and brightest in these sorts of programs. We should be promoting them. Ultimately, the core mission of a university is to advance people, knowledge and societies. It's not to advance diversity, equity and inclusion. And universities really need to remember that.
You're so right. And then we have a photograph up there on the screen of the current applicants for the project there. Now, Brianna, from your article, it appears that the focus of Monash is not to advance space exploration for humanity, as we did in the 60s with John F. Kennedy's famous speech. And I'm going to quote him here: "There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind," end quote. Perhaps Monash should go back and have a listen to actual space history and take some lessons from there. But is this just another example of a university prioritising race over results? And if so, is this a wider problem? Like, this is clearly not the only university course that has this issue. Are we looking at a university system in Australia that does prioritise DEI programs over merit?
That's right. This is a systemic issue. We've seen it across the Western world. We've seen it in the US, and we've seen it in Australia. And another example of affirmative action programs was last year the Education Minister, Jason Clare. He guaranteed all academically qualified Indigenous students Commonwealth funding. And then more recently, the Medical Research Board said that women and non-binary people would receive 50% of its investigative grants to senior scientists. So we're seeing this in the university sector, but also more broadly in industry, in business, in politics. It's a systemic issue.
It's a real shame, because space and universities are supposed to be this wonderful bastion of knowledge. It should be exciting and not a place where you go to focus on your race or your gender. I mean, it's all very depressing. But you pinned these terrible projects on the rise of critical race theory and affirmative action, which is really just racism by a different name. Now, I'm guessing that this is not just confined to Australia. You wrote that they're having the same problems overseas, but that there might be some kind of hope on the horizon with what happened at the US Supreme Court. Now, what are the lessons we can take from the US? Because something quite significant happened there recently.
That's right. The US Supreme Court came out with a decision that said, embracing affirmative action in the admissions system, we shouldn't go that way. And so that was a key decision for the US. Now, they have the Bill of Rights. We don't have that. So we're not in as good a position as they are. But still, they lead the world, and the fact that they made this decision is a great example that we should follow as best as we possibly can in our own education sector.
So does that mean that the US has actually made a ruling on this racism in university and said that, hey, that's not right in universities over there? And if so, have you seen anything that suggests Australian universities have taken at least some notice of that decision, or are we just rolling on like we were before?
Unfortunately, we do seem to be rolling on just like we did before. And in the world of diversity, equity and inclusions, equity means equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. And when we embrace affirmative action, it undermines the principle of everyone having a fair go, regardless of their background. So if we want to harness our nation's talent, then we need to put merit first and equity second. And I think most importantly, think about the taxpayer. They are the biggest investors in our education sector, and they deserve a good return on their investment. And our Productivity Commission report just shows that that's not happening. So we need to be more outcomes focused in our education sector and in our university sector. Taxpayers deserve better.
Well, you had an excellent statement, and I'm going to quote your piece now. You said, basing university admissions criteria on race rather than merit is not a good strategy for developing and harnessing our nation's talent, end quote. Now, that's very well said, Brianna. But I learned from another Specky writer that the university sector is the second most lucrative for the budget of the government than mining. So it's basically sitting underneath mining, and all the Labor Party is making a fortune out of this. And not only do they make a fortune out of university students, they also get to cultivate the next generation of left-wing voters. Are you worried at the IPA and yourself that perhaps the state no longer sees university as a place of learning at all, but rather as a place to, one, make money for the government, and two, indoctrinate voters? Like, if that's how we view university, maybe we're not going to get out of this problem anytime soon.
Well, that's true, and that is a concern of the IPA. And we haven't just seen this in universities. We've seen it in the schools, in the national curriculum, in teacher training. Indoctrination is the focus, and education is being sidelined. And if you look at the National Indigenous Space Program, it looks harmless. It looks like they're helping Indigenous students, but ultimately it's deeply divisive, and it undermines our academic merit-based system. And I think we've just had the Voice referendum, and Australians voted no. They said they didn't want to be divided on the basis of race in the Constitution. But this is just a side door entrance for affirmative action programs and for dividing Australians on the basis of race.
You know, it would have been great if Monash University had gone out into the regional areas to the schools there and said, look, this is space. How wonderful is space? If you work really hard, you can sign up to our programs and we will help you get there. Now, that would have been a properly inclusive and helpful program that would actually value merit and maybe inspire some new astronauts. No one would have any issues with that. But Brianna, you note that that program was harmless. Well, odd, but harmless. Now, do you think that you've seen peak random, or are you still filing through the universities looking for the next crazy article to write for the Specky?
I'm still filing through the universities because what they're teaching just keeps on getting crazier and crazier. I don't think we've hit as crazy as they can get. So I'm sure I will have more stuff for you in coming weeks and months.
Oh, I intend to get you back here with the next crazy trending story. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Brianna.
Thank you so much.